We're now in a situation where, unfortunately, almost all countries have experienced some degree of serious climate change impacts. And we have learned in those situations who were left behind and why. And so we must honor that understanding. Any mistakes, any shortcomings that have been experienced must be documented. And that information is crucial to be shared across maybe all other public authorities in all regions or provinces that may not have been equally affected, but who might be later on. The right to education, the right to science, so our each and everyone's capacity to understand climate change and to ask ourselves how they can contribute to mitigate climate change, to adapt, to protect other people's lives and health and human rights in the context of climate change, that very much depend on all of us having access to clear, trustworthy, sufficient, and accessible information. I think in all countries, it's very difficult for any of us to have that clear sense of what is in place and whether it is sufficient to protect us from what are becoming more foreseeable negative impacts of climate change on our human rights.
Climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's increasingly recognized as one of the most significant human rights challenges of our time. But how do we ensure our response is effective, equitable, and protects everyone, especially the most vulnerable? A crucial yet often underestimated part of the answer lies in access to information. In today's episode, we delve into why having clear, reliable, and accessible information about climate change, its impacts, the actions being taken by governments and businesses, and importantly, the lived experiences of those most affected isn't just helpful, but a fundamental prerequisite for having rights respecting climate action. Our conversation is grounded in a significant report titled Access to Information on Climate Change and Human Rights. This report was authored by our guest, Professor Elisa Morgera. Professor Morgera serves as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. She is a distinguished professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and director of One Ocean Hub with the extensive experience of advising governments and civil society on environmental and human rights issues. Her expertise makes her a leading voice in understanding how climate change intersects with human rights. Thank you so much, Elisa, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Elisa, you have authored a report by the title of Access to Information on Climate Change and Human Rights, where you argue that information is not just beneficial, but it's also a prerequisite for effective, inclusive, and rights respecting climate action. So, can we first begin this conversation by understanding what made you choose this topic as such and its significance?
Yes, no, thanks so much. I think that was a really interesting realization that there's been so much work on climate justice, and often that really focuses on public participation in decision making and a very significant work on access to justice. And we know about the global phenomenon of climate litigation. But in fact, all of this is premised on having enough information to understand both how climate change is progressing and how your human rights are being affected, and equally, which is quite a challenge, to having enough of a sense about how governments are responding to climate change, what measures they are putting in place to protect us from the negative impacts on climate change, and equally how business enterprises are putting in place measures that may or may not be effective to both mitigate climate change and also support the protection of human rights in the context of climate change. And unfortunately, I think in all countries, it's very difficult for any of us to have that clear sense of what is in place and whether it is sufficient to protect us from what are becoming more foreseeable negative impacts of climate change on our human rights.
Now, Alyssa, in this report, you discuss a lot of information that is absolutely essential for the general population to know. Would you want to discuss some of those sets of information that is absolutely essential for people to know to avoid the human right infringements that can be caused because of lack of information?
Yeah, so I think we all know we need more information on how the climate is evolving and meteorology. Not all regions have sufficient historical um, bodies of data to really help interpret the patterns and how they're changing. But that's only one part of the picture. And so a key point of that report was really saying how we also need to put together other information, which maybe we don't see as climate information, but it's information about nature, about access to water, about cultural heritage, human mobility, social and economic changes. All of that needs to be brought together for us to understand whose human rights are going to be most affected by climate change and whether or not we have responses that are adequate, particularly to protect people in situations that are most vulnerable to climate change impacts. And that means that often those bodies of data are spread across different government entities. Sometimes they're not accessible at the local level where we need to take immediate action and where we are at the forefront of climate change. So quite a lot of putting together of existing information and also realizing where we have gaps and therefore are unable even to plan properly for necessary measures to protect our human rights from the impacts of climate change.
Alyssa, in your report, you also talk about that how right to access to information is related to other host of other rights that are there. Would you want to take some time and maybe delve a little bit deeper on that? Because it's quite interesting how this piece of information could essentially affect our health, our education, our ability to learn. Would you want to take some time and maybe delve on that?
Yes, no, thanks so much. I think, well, first of all, access to information can save lives. And there were some very specific examples that were shared for the preparation of my report where either unavailable information, lack of information, or even the modalities with which information was shared, so not really being accessible for elderly people, persons with disabilities, meant that they were not able to protect their lives from severe climate change impacts. But beyond that, our right to health is very severely impacted by climate change in many dimensions, our physical health, our mental health. And once again, different people are exposed to different risks. Children, women, the elderly, persons with disabilities have different exposures and face higher levels of risk in the context of climate change. And we need information on the steps that they can take, and civil society and different public authorities need to take to protect their human rights, that are based on disaggregated data and on the lived experiences of those human rights holders who have a particular exposure to risks and require specific measures. But of course, the right to education, the right to science, so our each and everyone's capacity to understand climate change and to ask ourselves how they can contribute to mitigate climate change, to adapt, to protect other people's lives and health and human rights in the context of climate change, that very much depend on all of us having access to clear, trustworthy, sufficient, and accessible information.
Alyssa, I would imagine that in the preparation to this report, you would have encountered various examples, as you just pointed out, that how lack of information can also lead to deaths. Would you want to give some example wherein you saw the contrast in play, wherein an information that was available in time saved lives, helped protect environment, and in the same place where there was misinformation or no information at all? I mean, we see that in our everyday lives around us. But I think in your preparation to report, if you want to share a couple of examples from that experience.
Yeah, maybe just in general terms, but I think particularly the context of early warning is a critical one where We need to understand whether there is enough information for different actors to play their role and save lives. If there is situations like bringing people to security, also planning rescue centers and making sure there are all the facilities and that are needed and protections for women, children and girls, for the elderly, for persons with disabilities, and many individuals are, can experience multiple grounds of discrimination in those situations. And unfortunately, very often, particularly when major environmental events have occurred for the first time in a certain region, often we are not prepared and we can't think through in the abstract how different individuals and groups what they may need. But I think what was a key point in the report was that we're now in a situation where, unfortunately, almost all countries have experienced some degree of serious climate change impacts. And we have learned in those situations who were left behind and why. And so we must honor that understanding. Any mistakes, any shortcomings that have been experienced must be documented. And that information is crucial to be shared across maybe all other public authorities in all regions or provinces that may not have been equally affected, but who might be later on. So there's an element also of what we consider essential data to feed into that notion of access to information. And a key point is that the experiences of those left behind, the understandings of why, what we didn't think about in terms of ensuring meaningful and effective protection of their human rights in the context of climate change, that must be an essential core of the information we all need to have access to prevent mistakes that we have done before, and in fact to just enhance the protections that may be available to us in terms of resources, but just need that concerted attention to collecting that information directly from the people who have been most affected and bringing it into decision-making spaces and allocation of, and where we decide about allocation of resources, revise plans, and improve our early warning and response mechanisms. And then, of course, making that information available to everyone to know what they can expect, how they can have access to that, and make sure they avail themselves of those protections that are in place.
Elisa, in your report, you talk about host of other information that we need to make available from the side of causes, from the side of effects, from the sides of steps being taken by the government, their commitments, and on the side of businesses, and a lot of other pieces of information that are basically essential. Would you say that this point of experience of the people who have really been affected by the effects of climate change would be the most integral and core part of the access to information? Because I'm also trying to realize that there are 100 moving pieces. If there needs to be our priority, what should be our priority in the first go? What we need to make accessible to people in the first place?
No, I very much agree with you. I think that, and that's kind of a bit of a challenge in this area, that we think, oh, we need technical information on climate change, on other measures, and of course that's important. But often in this approach that's very technical, we tend to divide things up. And so even the whole idea of connecting sources of information across separate ministries on nature, on climate, on cultural heritage may appear almost impossible. And the reality is that in the lived experiences of people who have been affected by climate change, all these things come together in very clear, vivid ways. And so in a way, while it may seem like an additional effort, it's in fact something that, if it is taken very seriously and to the core, as you say, put to the core, helps with the understanding of how everything is connected and what we need to do across different sectors that often operate in separate ways and without sufficient communication. So it might actually be the most effective way to bring together all the information we need to be better prepared to respond to climate change and, in fact, take also more effective climate action more generally.
The interesting part that I always come across in these conversations, Elisa, is the importance of local communities being brought into decision making. Every professional emphasizes it with full force that it's the most important aspect, but the tragedy is such that when we read commentaries or different policies, that is that one biggest missing piece that we find. Would you want maybe share an example where you saw local decision making, local knowledge being integrated into policy making, or a response wherein you saw synergies between an action being taken at a higher level and at the local level?
So I can think of an example that's kind of fully formed, but I think I've seen several initiatives, and this is also, I think, something I was underscoring in the report. There's a variety of ways in which different local authorities, civil society, research institutions, communities themselves are mobilizing to bring together the evidence, to have their voices heard, and offer that to government to be part of that information that can lead to different decisions. And I think what's important is to recognize that, well, maybe in an ideal world, we'd want the government to be the one taking the initiatives, but sometimes they might also not have the right skill sets to do so, or they might not have that the right conditions to really make sure they are listening to the voices that are of those most affected. And so it's important to kind of move away from an idea of only working in the ways we've already worked before, and realizing that funding, support, understanding, and connections need to be brought to support these initiatives that are coming up from the ground up. And recognizes that community-led, women-led, children co-led initiatives on climate change they're not something else, something on the side, but again, something that can very much help the government to do something that should be kind of at the core of its work on climate information, and then well-informed decision making.
Alyssa, another aspect of your report focuses on intersectionality. And I think that is something that is often left out of debates, but it also is very much crucial for the granular decision making that we need to make today. Without elucidating more on the concept, would you want to explain intersectionality as a concept, and then again delve why is it so important to focus on it while we are providing information?
Yes, no, thanks so much. And again, intersectionality is a concept that maybe is not so familiar to those working, beyond maybe the social sciences or working in very technical areas such as climate change is often seen. But we all know that climate change has differentiated impacts, and that some people are more affected than others. And intersectionality explains why that is the case, that often individuals or groups face multiple grounds of vulnerability and discrimination in their lives because possibly they, because of gender, because of race, because of class, because of maybe disabilities. And we need to realize that they are facing very distinctive challenges. And, to protect their rights effectively, we need to understand those differentiated situations and the fact they may accumulate or intersect in ways that are very unique to different individuals and groups. And again, it's very difficult to understand those situations in the abstract, although we have all the human rights norms and hopefully disaggregated data to provide some guidance. But to me, it's really only reaching out and listening to the voice of those who have experienced those intersecting grounds of discrimination and marginalization. So through their life experience, that we can understand what we're doing wrong and how we can change our actions to make sure that those who find themselves in the most vulnerable situations are adequately protected. And if we achieve to do that, everyone else will definitely be better protected too.
And Alyssa, are there examples of intersectionality in practice, maybe an initiative or maybe a program or anything wherein such rich data has helped us in making better decisions?
So I think there were a few examples that were shared with me when I was preparing the report, particularly by civil society working on children's human rights. They were incredible. So they were very much based on these methodologies about listening to children, understanding their experiences. And again, because of that process, I think they were able to come up with really brilliant and very feasible ways in which to understand what needs needed to be fulfilled, and also how to share the information in ways that were meaningful and accessible to children, including children of very early age. And so there were like some case studies that are still available on the website of the report. All the submissions are there. And I think it's really good for others to look into that. I think children is one case where for everyone, every professional who has not worked with children, it just seems like such a difficult situation to even like being able to have a communication, a conversation that can help address, adult concerns around climate change mitigation and adaptation. And in reality, we have plenty of really good methodologies and approaches that have worked and show how that intergenerational dialogue is not only possible, but like essential and so helpful to make sure we are both listening to children and being able to better protect them from the impacts of climate change, including when they may have disabilities and they may face other areas of discrimination or vulnerability in the context of climate change.
Elisa, I think as you've in your report and your answers, it's amply clear that to fight climate change, of course, we need the right information, which is like the first tool in our arsenal to fight climate change as well. But having said that and knowing that what the state of available information is and how challenging it can be, what impacts do you see do we have in case we do not have right information? What I'm trying to get at is why is it so important for us to have right information or access to information?
Yeah, well, first of all, to be able to know what is in place for us to be protected from the impacts of climate change, but also to be able to question and participate in decision making when we realize that not the right measures are in place. And I think this is the area where maybe governments may be hesitant to share information out of fear of being found at fault. But again, this is not a concern we should have. It's in everyone's interest to make sure that we put all our heads together and we look into whether what's being put in place is effective or not. And again, on the basis of lived experiences. So we need that information that is timely, that is full, that is trustworthy, about understanding how much climate change is worsening, how it's been felt in our countries, in our local realities, in what ways our social, cultural, and economic lives are being affected and who's been affected the most. And that has to guide then how we make decisions in all areas, really, of public policy to make sure we take into account what we know about climate change and its impacts, and we do our best to both mitigate climate change and also adapt to it and protect human rights in that process. And that has to do with how we allocate public finance, what kind of services we need, understanding who has access to them and whether we need to change the ways in which any available resources are accessible, particularly to those in most vulnerable situations. And on the basis of that information, we also must be able to go to court and raise issues if we see that our public authorities are not doing what is necessary and required of them to do to protect us from the climate change impacts.
But Elisa, at the same time, like as access to information is being argued as the cornerstone of protecting human rights from climate change effects as well. But in today's world as well, as we see that there is a deliberate attempt to not focus on the compelling data and science that is available. So while we are making a case for access to information, does it also misdiagnose inaction on the part of our leaders and people who are in the place of authority?
So there was one part of the report that discussed also that this is not a level playing field where we just need to do better to bring together the information and make it accessible. But unfortunately, we are in a situation where we have a lot of forces, be that public or private, that contribute to misinformation and disinformation on climate change and human rights. And this is something that has already been looked into also by other UN special rapporteurs, and there are very clear obligations from states and public authorities to identify and combat disinformation and misinformation, specific responsibilities from different sectors of the business community to avoid being part or even funding and fueling disinformation campaigns, lobbying, advertising, all these different ways in which disinformation about climate change and its impacts on human rights are enabled and continue to proliferate. So it is true that it's not just about what we can do better, but also what we need to prevent and, in fact, completely eradicate all those very diverse strategies that that disinform or misinform us and allow for, I think, specific interests who have brought us climate change and who are benefiting from it, to keep the status quo and prevent the meaningful action that we need to mitigate and adapt to climate change.
Alyssa, I would go a step further and try and understand from your perspective. Climate information does not necessarily mean climate action, because there might be people who might be willfully ignoring it as well, let alone if they're not engaging in disinformation. But what, in your experience, if we marry climate access to information with a particular aspect, definitely results in climate action? It's not related to the report, but I'm just curious that what did you find to be the most best possible thing which works with climate information to get people to work on climate action?
I mean, the first is that awareness. I think, to me, maybe the most important area, or one of the most important areas of access to information on climate change and human rights, are the impacts of climate change on our health. And that is meaningful because it's not only about those people who maybe have found themselves facing the most severe, sudden climate events, but even in our daily life, our health is being affected by climate change in many ways, and that we may not realize. And that I'm hoping, may mean that even those people who may not feel they have an immediate stake or have had an experience, dramatic experience of climate change in their lives, may realize that this is a topic that they need to mobilize themselves, and that affects them and their families and their loved ones in ways that maybe they hadn't quite realized before, based on their own kind of lived experience. And it is about like how each pieces of science maybe speak to us more deeply and in a way that prompt us to take action compared to others. I mean, this is a big dilemma, I think, for all of us working on climate change. We have such powerful scientific advancements showing us what are the causes of climate change, what are the impacts, what we need to do. But at the same time, even that science in and of itself doesn't necessarily lead to taking the action that we need. And there are other powerful forces at play in that. So that's where like mobilization maybe by those sectors of civil society that haven't yet felt as exposed and maybe think they may be safe from climate change because of privilege or just their life experiences, might realize that this is really affecting all of us, and we all have a stake in making sure effective climate action is being taken.
Elisa, one question that I think, like after reading your report and a prominent section that you've dedicated to responsibility of business, I think anyone and everyone who's in this field knows that how big oil since the very beginning, like in 1970s, they were very well aware of the harmful effects of excessive use of fossil fuels, what they would have and how it would entail climate change effects. And later, even today, we see that greenwashing happens to become a very predominantly accepted way of working in some certain business communities. And now I think with the framework that you're proposing with respect to access to information, it counters and gives us a tool to basically provide right information against these activities that are happening. But what, in your opinion, could be the effective way to implement and enforce these frameworks that you've talked about? Because it seems like, as you said, this possible disinformation campaign that still goes on does deter climate action, but access to information can be a powerful tool. So would you want to share some of the possible ways with which maybe we could utilize these frameworks that you're talking about to effectively counter this historical, so to say, deep-rooted ways of working?
Well, and I think in some ways there's so many layers of access to information that your comments bring to light. And the first is, I mean, I wonder how many people out there do know the oil and gas, and some of the governments who were among the first to exploit oil and gas knew about the impacts that this would have on the global climate and still went ahead for decades. This is becoming now more known, but I don't think it's necessarily as commonly known as we need it to be. And again, the greenwashing practices, I think they're known to some sectors of civil society and experts, but they may not be known enough by all those who are exposed to those greenwashing practices. So in that sense, one aspect is making that information commonly available, part of people's education at all levels, so that they are aware that there are, as I was saying, specific private interests who have been shaping our reality, who have brought climate change to us, and who have kept us still in a situation that is not one of let's say, information asymmetry, in being able to really put the finger to the causes of climate change and the priority solutions we need to take. And so that report on access to information was kind of taking a bird's eye view, but the next report, which I'm currently working on, is focused on the fossil fuel-based economy, and it's really meant itself to contribute to access to information, bringing together the evidence that many other states and civil society and researchers have brought to light, researched and analyzed about for how long the oil and gas companies and certain governments have known about the impacts of those activities in bringing climate change and in exposing, creating all those risks and impacts for human rights, and what that means in terms of the action we need to take, both in terms of the phasing out fossil fuels, but also taking much more strict legal action about any attempt to still keep the public uninformed or disinformed about the causes of climate change and the priority actions we need to take to really steer humanity towards a safer climate in the next 5 years, because that is the window of opportunity that science is indicating is in front of us. So very tight, but still meaningful time where things can change.
Thank you so much, Elisa. We eagerly look forward to your next report as well. I'm very sure that it would give us, again, much needed required frameworks for us to look into the crisis that we have and also may be able to extract the solutions that we need. Before we wrap up this conversation, I'm just curious to ask from you if you have a call to action which we can share with different stakeholders. Of course, access to information that is broad spanning and touches upon the role of different stakeholders. But if you would want to share a call to action, that would be great.
Yeah, I think what actually states are really keen to hear, and I'm also keen to hear, and you were asking me examples as well, is are there any experiences of constructive, I think, engagement between public authorities, people that have been most affected by climate change, researchers, or community organizations, where we have been able to effectively share those lived experiences, and we've been able to co-develop solutions that very much have at the center that understanding of who's been left behind and why, and what we need to do differently. And little by little, I'm hearing about these stories, and I think just sharing them more and more, showing that this is possible, that this is actually very helpful. It helps governments to do very hard tasks that by themselves maybe they've been struggling, to put forward. And it can happen in many ways as well. It can happen at, at the level of a school, at the level of a football club, at the level of a city, or, in other ways, within regions, just showing that it is possible, it can be done in different ways. And while we might not replicate the exact same model, we can all learn and, gather insights from what has been possible somewhere and think afresh about what can be possible to be done, in our context.
I think, again, the arrow moves towards more listening to the lived experience of people on the ground. And I think that is certainly a key takeaway from me in this conversation. So thank you so much, Elisa, for taking out time for this insightful discussion and for all the work that you are doing. I think in a pre-recording call as well, it was evidently clear that access to information is like the centerpiece of all the work that is happening. If we have access to the right information, which is again accessible, there's a lot of difference that all of us can make, even someone who's not working in the field of climate change. So thank you so much for your time and for your work.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.